This is the Sunday Times Politics Weekly, where we chat about the week's big political stories. I'm Mike Siluma, and thanks for joining us. Our first big story this time has, of course, to be the municipal elections, which are taking place on Monday. Ahead of the poll, we'll look at which major cities are likely to fall to coalition governments and how those coalitions are likely to be structured. After that, we'll be looking at the sea change in the ANC, which has seen the return to the political forefront of key leaders, including ex-President Thabo Mbeki. We'll ask what lies behind this development and what does it mean for the ANC.
This econ is racist.
I've never, ever been a spy.
Can the VBS Bank loot?
The problem is that pinky.
I'll never subject myself to whiteness.
Order! I'm listening.
Can you have consistency, Honorable Chair?
Corruption was an Olympic sport. They will always win gold.
This is not a ship.
At arms, can you please come in?
Point of order.
Let's welcome now our guests for today, Kgothatso Madisa, who's the Sunday Times political reporter, Paul Berkowitz, who is a researcher and director at the Third Republic, as well as Dawie Scholtz, who's an independent electoral analyst. Let us start with you, Paul. If you're looking at how the metros, because I thought we should look in the main at the metros, how they are standing at the moment and how do the parties stack up. Shall we start in Joburg to look at the current balance of power between the political parties?
Thanks, Mike. Well, going all the way back to 2016, Mike, there was a situation where no party had a majority. The ANC had a plurality. They had just more than the DA. It was very close, but no party had 50%. And the first coalition government in Johannesburg was the DA and a number of smaller parties. And in the last year, since 2019, in the resignation of Herman Mashaba as mayor, the ANC has led the metro. And in the meantime, 7 DA wards have been lost in by-elections. 3 were won from the DA by the ANC. 3 were won by the Patriotic Alliance. 1 was won by Al Jama. So as things stand right now, just before the elections, Mike, the ANC would be able to form a majority coalition without the help of the EFF or any bigger parties. But that is very likely to change. We'll be looking at the 2019 results and some of the events leading up to the election. And our model has both the DA and the ANC losing more seats in the metro, with Action SA winning anywhere between 15 and 20% of the seats, and the EFF continuing to grow. Now, what coalition will be formed there will depend on the exact allocations of the seats and the performances of the DA and the ANC, but also the EFF and Action SA. So there's the potential for there to be 4 big parties without a clear majority anyway. And there's a number of options when it comes to coalitions there. I think which coalition is eventually formed will depend a lot on the relative fortunes of those parties and also the personalities at the top at the national level. Who is prepared to work with who? The DA has already said they won't work with the EFF. Action SA has said they won't work with the ANC.
Yeah. I'd like us to come back to that, at those possible permutations, from a political and ideological point of view. And out in Tshwane, Paul?
Similar situation broadly, Mike. The parties we spoke about, ANC, DA, EFF, Action SA, will be expected to be at the forefront. Action SA is not expected to do as well in Tshwane. Also, based on past results and trends, the Freedom Front Plus should win even more seats from the DA. The DA potentially could do very badly in Tshwane, which is interesting because the party was the one with the plurality in Tshwane in 2016, even finishing ahead of the ANC. But the DA has the potential to do incredibly badly in Tshwane under a number of scenarios and may even be fighting with the EFF for second and third place. So over there, the other parties, other opposition parties have the potential to lead any coalition, and that's specifically the EFF or Action SA.
Okay, and then the interesting one is eThekwini. I mean, traditionally, it's been regarded as the ANC's stomping ground. You know, can we assume that it will stay under the ANC's control?
Broadly speaking, Mike, that's very likely, but there's a growing possibility that the ANC will lose its majority in eThekwini and possibly even in Mangaung as well. So in the previous election, we had 4 of the 8 metros that were under coalition government. It was the 3 Gauteng metros and Nelson Mandela Bay. But the only metros that are really safe this time for the ANC and the DA respectively are Buffalo City and the city of Cape Town. In eThekwini, the ANC is still expected to do very well and probably finish with 45% or more of the vote. In that case, the party will have its pick of opposition partners, and what's likely, given political theory in general, is that the ANC will look to form a coalition with some of the smaller parties, which may include some of the new parties that are campaigning, including the Abantu Batho Congress and the Justice and Employment Party.
And I'm intrigued about the dynamic in Cape Town, particularly. I mean, in the other places you mentioned, Action SA as a possible factor or as a player, you know, even if it's a small player. In Cape Town, you've got the Good and you've got a couple of other smaller ones. What do you think might happen there?
We've been looking to see if there's a possibility, if there's a possible scenario, Mike, where the DA could lose its majority. It's highly unlikely. The party is very strong in Cape Town. It won 2/3 of the vote in 2016, and in most of the DA wards and by-elections over the last 5 years, the parties remain strong. But the parties you mentioned, Mike, Good, Cape Muslim Congress, the Cape Party, the one that's campaigning on secession, and the Freedom Front Plus as well, they've all got the potential to take votes away from the DA. It wouldn't be a surprise if the DA retained the City of Cape Town, but instead of 66%, it might even be in the mid to low 50s.
Kgothatso, I'd like for you to come in here because I'm you know, when we looking at all these, most of the metros, we're using the ANC as the reference point. In other words, will it retain its majority or will it lose it? You know, and if it wants to retain power, who might it want to talk to? Would you just give us an idea of currently how the ANC is reading the situation? What is their intention? Are they intending to regain control of all the metros, or have they made peace with the possibility of not being able to go back to single-handedly running any of the metros?
Bro Mike, I think they've made their intentions very clear so far, especially in Tshwane, that they want to go all out to win the city back. They've made mistakes before, you know, in 2016, leading to the DA taking over. But this time around, they want Tshwane. They've even deployed the Deputy President, David Mabuza, to focus his campaign in Tshwane. The president also keeps, doing rallies and campaigning in Tshwane. So in Tshwane, they want it, and I think they have a strong chance of getting it back. In Johannesburg, they've never really had a majority. That's why they went into coalition with the smaller parties. They will want to retain it, but I don't think they'll do it with an outright majority. The DA, it has sort of fallen off, and I think they also stopped paying a lot of attention in Johannesburg because they've realized that they are losing it. But the ANC is thinking, and when you speak to them and when you look at how they're campaigning, they want these, especially Johannesburg and Tshwane. They really want them. They even launched their manifesto in Tshwane. So the thinking there is that they want outright majority. They're not even putting up a mayoral candidate in any of these areas because they don't want to to shake things up like it happened in 2016 when they announced Kgothatso in Tshwane, and things just went south. So they are being careful, but they went all out they're going all out to get these, and I think they have a fair shot of winning.
Okay, Dawie, I'd like for you to come in here because for lay people, the whole idea of coalitions can be very confusing, and even the necessity of coalitions may be a perplexing one, for ordinary people. What would you say are the factors which are driving the drift towards coalitions?
Well, look, I think it's really interesting, right? If one, and maybe I should also just say I broadly agree with what Paul has said. I think that those sound like sensible numbers, and I think things are inherently uncertain in this election. We've had very little polling before the election. We've had very few by-elections. So I think no one really knows what's going to happen exactly. But it is probably fair to say, given the historic voting patterns we've seen, that the cities that were in coalition territory last time are likely to be again, and potentially even further in coalition territory. And I'll explain about what I mean by that in a moment. But then, what's causing that drift? Fundamentally, what's happening is the ANC is going down, right? The ANC percentage is going below 50. And that's causing a coalition discussion to start. So then the question is, what's driving this drift for the ANC below 50, right? This downwards drift. And it's a couple of things, right? So the one thing is just in the last 2 or 3 elections, there's just been a really interesting development in our elections, which is that the turnout patterns have really fundamentally changed. The kind of relative level of turnout of, specifically in places like Johannesburg and Tshwane, of suburban voters that kind of typically vote against the ANC has gotten really, really high. It's gone up a lot, or at least have stayed at relatively high levels, whilst turnout in the townships, where the ANC typically does quite well, has been drifting down. And we saw that in 2016, we saw it in 2019, and it's being driven by a group of ANC voters, historically ANC voters, that I think are frustrated with the ANC and are choosing not to vote, right? I think that's one of the trends we see. So this lower turnout and the gap between suburban turnout and township turnout driving that's I think one important driver. The other very important demographic driver is just what's happening in the black electorate, right? There's a portion of former ANC voters that have moved away from the ANC, and specifically in the 2016 and 2019 moved to the EFF. Largely, and a little bit to the DA, right? So I think a very good, summary of that is if you look at the 2011 local government election, right? I know that's a long time ago, but it's a good base. The 2011 local government election, and you look at the entire black electorate throughout all of Gauteng, the ANC won 86% of the vote in the black electorate in 2011, right? If you look at the same numbers for 2016, right? So 5 years later, they were down to 68. Right, in the black electorate in Gauteng. That's, minus 18% in 5 years. And it went mostly to the EFF, but some of it also went to the DA, particularly in 2016. And that's the fundamental problem for the ANC, is that they've historically relied on winning overwhelming majorities in the townships to power that result of a 50% plus, in all of those metros. And their numbers in the townships are coming down. And that's why they're shifting below 50. And I think what Paul has raised is absolutely correct. There's now an even additional ingredient in this, right, which is the emergence of Action SA. And, who knows how much they're going to get. But just if you look at social media, if you look at their rally today, there clearly are some numbers there. It's not irrelevant, and potentially even significant, right? But we don't know exactly how much more. There's no credible evidence to say exactly how much they'll get. And that's complicating the math even further, because my suspicion is that Action SA is, yes, taking votes from the DA and the EFF, but also potentially taking votes from the ANC, which I think is going to make this coalition discussion even more pressing, and making all the parties even further away from 50. So quite complicated.
Let me ask you this: do you see us going back to the days of a one-party dominant sort of arrangement, or do you think that those days will never come back?
Look, one never says never in politics, right? But one can speak in terms of likelihoods, right? I think it's highly unlikely. And let me tell you why, Mike. I think what's powering a lot of this, right, is, as I've said, it's the overall drift is because of a shift within the black electorate. And if you go and you do the research deeply, right, which I've seen some folks do this research deeply, right, is that, historically, as I've said, there's a big portion of the black electorate that just was incredibly positive, supporting, loyal to the ANC, right? And it's an absolute fact that that's still true, right? So if you do the numbers, that there's still a very significant portion of that portion of the electorate that is very strongly supportive of the ANC, but it's coming down. And there's a growing number of voters that within the black electorate specifically that are either kind of really frustrated with the ANC to the extent that they kind of decided they will not vote ANC anymore, or that are kind of open to thinking about it and, who haven't previously really been particularly open to thinking about it. And that slice of the electorate that is absolutely certain to vote a kind of ANC is just going down every year. With every election, it's a smaller portion of the electorate, and the amount of undecideds is higher. And as the undecideds go up, some portion of them will go to the EFF, some portion of them will go to Action SA, some portion of them will go DA, some portion will still go ANC, or some portion will not vote. But that portion, it's getting bigger, and that's what's driving the numbers down fundamentally. And there's just one more thing which I think is just a critical number. Like South African democracy isn't directly comparable to other democracies in the world. But there are certain things that just count for all democracies. And the one thing which is true is that if you ask people, is South Africa on the right track or the wrong track? The wrong track number is just absolutely enormous. It's gotten to the level where 70%, 75% of South Africans think we're on the wrong track, including ANC voters saying we're on the wrong track. We stay loyal to the ANC, but we're on the wrong track. And if you've been governing for 27 years, at the next election, it's going to be 30 years. The election thereafter, it'll be 35 years. And you've been governing for that long, and you're presiding over a wrong track number of 60 or 70%. It's incredibly difficult to see a swing back to total one-party dominance in the way we've had it in the past, given these prevailing demographic trends. And also, sorry for the long answer, one interesting thing about this as well is, if you go into it deeper, it's also demographic from an age perspective, right? So older voters are much more loyal to the ANC, much more sticking to the ANC. Younger voters are the ones that are either done with the ANC or willing to think about alternatives, right? And depending on how this evolves, right, like maybe, the cohort that's currently 24 to 28, 5 years from now, they're going to be, 28 to 33. And there's going to be a new younger cohort coming in, below them. And if the guys that are currently 24 to 28 keep their view, which is more EFF, a little bit more DA, potentially more Action SA, and they keep that view as they age through, right? And a new cohort, which is also a little bit more opposition-minded, comes in. You could see that demographic shift starting to significantly affect the ANC number, as it already has to some extent.
If we look at our experience so far of coalition government, Kgothatso, how well do you think that we've been able to navigate that space?
Coalitions are a bit tricky because you are, and we need to remember that most of the parties that went into sort of a coalition agreement, it wasn't cast in stone. It was just a matter of, for instance, in the matter of the DA and the EFF in Johannesburg. It was just an agreement where they'll say, we'll vote for you on other issues if you also pursue push through our interest of insourcing and all of those things. So I think in Joburg it seemed to work between the EFF and the DA, but then you see what happened then was that when they had a fallout, both the DA and EFF, because the EFF wanted a quid pro quo type thing where they said, no, we can support you fully in Johannesburg if you give us Tshwane. So because those engagements didn't go well, they ended up fighting and handing over the powers to the ANC, literally on a silver platter. So coalitions they're tricky in that sense that they will have to think about how they can make sure that whatever clashes they have in politically and all of that, they are able to they don't affect the agreements that they have, because you end up handing power back to the opposition. So Bashaba right now has closed the door on the ANC, and I believe the ANC would have loved to work with Mashaba, especially in Johannesburg, should no one get a majority. But he's now closing that door. What does that mean? That means he's opening up a relationship between the DA and the ANC. And once that happens, then the smaller parties will not have any say. They will not, they won't have any kind of power. So yeah, so I think so far the country with the experience that we've seen in Tshwane, they did well to a certain extent, but those political clashes, end up ruining whatever strides they were making in government. I mean, even in Tshwane, things went south. The government had to even intervene and put it under administration and all of that. So without being too long, I think coalitions can work. They just need to be formalized. If it's a contract that they have to sign, so be it. I just don't know what the rules of engagement are on that front. But they need to be able to withstand, the agreements need to be able to withstand whatever political clashes the parties have for the greater good type thing. When they don't agree on something, it shouldn't affect the entire agreement, like we saw in Johannesburg. So I think that's where we perhaps need to start to say, how do we ensure that the political whatever agreement you have in a city will withstand whatever disagreements or fight the parties can have. So a formalized structure perhaps is what we need. But I believe they do work, and they are the future of politics in South Africa.
Paul, do you share the hopefulness of Kgothatso that we have to make coalitions work, and we just have to learn to live with them?
Mike, let's say yes and no. I agree with Kgothatso that coalitions are our future. There's no use in wishing them away based on the electoral system we have, which is proportional representation heavy, and we look at comparable election systems throughout the world in other countries. This is what we can expect. Dawie also alluded to it a bit. The historical anomaly, we're going to see it in future as an historical anomaly, that the ANC had a supermajority, which is largely the political capital built up over decades under apartheid. We are going to see more coalitions. We're going to see more parties. I am slightly cautious, maybe a bit more cynical than Kgothatso, that they can work just as they are. If we've seen anything over the last 5 years, it's that the parties, big and small, across the major coalitions in the important metros, we cannot trust them to do the right thing and not pursue narrow interests. Some of the small parties have used their kingmaker status to extract other benefits. I'm thinking of parties like the Patriotic Alliance that was first with the DA in Nelson Mandela Bay and then crossed the floor to join the ANC and was rewarded with the deputy mayor position. We cannot afford to have that. So, Mike, I think there's 2 points. I think there's a responsibility on all South Africans and civil society and people that work in these areas, that would include some of us, to monitor these coalitions very closely, to hold the politicians to their promises, and to raise the bar and demand a higher standard of engagement. We cannot have another 5 wasted years of collapsing councils. We cannot have more Metsi Maholos or Mohali cities where parties run out the clock or boycott council meetings and collapse council because there's no quorum. We cannot have that anymore. We need to demand a much higher standard, and the parties need to be accountable to the electorate. And that also means political maturity, both on the side of the parties and the electorate. There will always be members of the big parties that are not happy that coalitions are being formed. There's probably a huge chunk of the EFF that was not happy to work with the DA, and vice versa. Many DA supporters have expressed on social media that they think the party has some right to govern with the majority. And as we've said, that's not how our system works. The second and final point, Mike, is that I think what we will see, and what we are seeing already, is that the big parties are not internally coherent, that there is factionalism. We know it's bad in the ANC. and there is evidence of that in the DA as well. What I mean, the consequence of this potentially for coalitions is that decisions that are made from the top and supposed to filter down, decisions at the national level, may not be honored at the regional level. The EFF in the last 5 years was very unhappy with the DA, and that led to falling out in Nelson Mandela Bay and Tshwane. But the Johannesburg coalition of the DA and the EFF held partly because of the personalities involved. And that's what we also need to expect from the parties, that we need some flexibility.
Yeah.
We may face interesting complexities with all the parties and all the intersecting relationships, that some parties have this kind of coalition in one metro and a different one there. And we need to be more mature and more flexible in how these coalitions are managed, both as political parties and South Africans.
Yeah. Kgothatso, before we wrap it up, there's another political theme that I wanted us to touch on very quickly, and that relates to what's happening in the ANC itself. I see that there have been a number of senior leaders who have come back to the political forefront, who previously seemed to have withdrawn themselves. Most notably, former President Thabo Mbeki himself, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, and people like that, Kgalema Motlanthe, campaigning quite strongly for the party. What do you think is happening there?
Yes, Bro Mike. It's very interesting to witness. I mean, during the former President Jacob Zuma's term, you never saw Kgalema Motlanthe, for instance, wearing ANC colors on the streets, asking people to vote. Same with Thabo Mbeki. There's a shift in the ANC, and I think it's possibly Ramaphosa, summoning power and cementing himself to when he went back to all these people and said, look, we think there's still a role you can play in the party. The people that you had fought with, or the things that you didn't agree with in the ANC are changing. And he's using the renewal program that they have to call them back. And you've seen quite a number of them coming back. I mean, for instance, you have someone like former police minister Sidney Mufamadi, who has now been appointed as Ramaphosa's security advisor. We spoke to him last week about his return, and he admittedly says, look, when Thabo Mbeki was recalled, I was one of the people to resign. Because we didn't agree with the leadership that was coming into the ANC. We didn't agree with what they were doing. So we thought, no, let's leave and do something else with our lives. So he's now back because they believe that the government of Ramaphosa perhaps works best. You also have Mojang Kukumbi, who was Mbeki's legal advisor and is now on the panel that is investigating the response to the riots that took place in July. You have a former NPA boss, Bulelani Ngcuka. You understand? So who's now working on the party strategy on the expropriation of land without compensation. So there's quite a number of them. I mean, Mlambo-Ngcuka, for instance, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka just came back from finished her term at the UN. Immediately she goes in and is campaigning for the ANC, is even addressing an ANC event. When she was asked whether she's back and she's back in politics and whether she'd be looking at becoming coming into government or becoming as the rumors are saying that they wanted, that others wanted to become the next deputy president. She didn't deny it. She just said, no, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. So there's a shift in the ANC, which it's cementing Ramaphosa's power, and he's using previously trusted people to gather or to bring back people who left or who felt that they can't associate with the ANC under Zuma's term. They are all coming back, and they are all gathering around him. For instance, we have not seen Thabo Mbeki attending the party's manifesto. He's doing that. He's even engaging business people and professionals about the manifesto, telling them why this part was added, why it makes sense, the social compact agreement. He's engaging with it, and I think it's just that it's Ramaphosa cementing himself, putting himself in pole position, and to an extent, it is going to work in his favor, especially if we look into the ANC's conference next year in 2022. It is going to work in his favor.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to say let's wrap it up here in this week's edition of the Sunday Times Politics Weekly. And I'd like to thank our guests for the conversation, Kgothatso Madisa, who's a Sunday Times political reporter, Paul Berkowitz, who's a researcher and director at the Third Republic, as well as Dawie Scholtz, who's an independent electoral analyst. And by the way, you can find a podcast of this conversation on iona.fm, on Spotify, on Google Podcast, on Apple Podcast, or wherever you prefer to source your podcasts. Until next time, we still say stay safe, sanitize, wear the mask, and avoid crowded places. I'm Siluma, signing off.